Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of the So Happy Together podcast. I'm your host, Ellie, and today I'm going to be talking about why you date the way you do. In this episode, we're going to explore where our attachment styles come from and how our earliest relationships actually shape our nervous system, and why no matter how self aware or intentional we can still find ourselves repeating the same relational patterns. If you've ever wondered why relationships feel so intense, why you panic when someone pulls away, shut down when emotions rise, or feel both comforted and overwhelmed by closeness, this episode is for you. And I want to start with an important reminder. This isn't about blame, not toward yourself, your parents, or anyone you've dated. This is about awareness and compassion, about learning what your nervous system adapted to and how that might still be influencing the way you connect today. This is about understanding how your nervous system learned to survive connection and realizing that now you get to choose something different. You get to choose understanding over self-blame and clarity over chaos. I want to talk about why attachment awareness actually matters. Understanding our attachment styles isn't about creating labels, it's about creating context. In the first episode, if you listened, I shared that I do have an anxious attachment style. And I didn't start learning about my attachment style because I wanted a diagnosis or a label. I started learning about it because I was confused and exhausted by my own reactions in relationships. I wanted to understand the outcomes I kept experiencing and why I was choosing the partners I was choosing. Logically and physically, I could feel that something was off in my relationships. The distance felt threatening, the silence felt loud, and uncertainty felt unbearable. When that happens, that is because your nervous system doesn't detect danger based on logic. It detects danger based on past experiences. And this can be triggered by things like tone, distance, silence, conflict, or even a memory. Basically, anything that feels familiar to your nervous system in a way that once signaled a threat. After that, you'll usually start feeling sensations throughout your body. That might look like chest tightness, nausea, restlessness, feeling hot, or even disassociation. Signals that your body is telling you something feels wrong. For me personally, my heart rate goes up, I start getting hot, and sometimes I do feel nauseous. When you're in this state, your brain is not thinking logically, you're in survival mode. What does happen, though, is that your mind starts searching for meaning. Your thoughts rush in to interpret the discomfort. You might start asking yourself, what did I do wrong? Or thinking, this is about to fall apart. I'm not safe. I'm not wanted. I'm being abandoned. And this is where the spiral begins. Those thoughts intensify your body's response, and then your body's response starts confirming the thoughts you're having. Logic gets quieter, fear gets louder, and the more intense the thoughts become, the more intense the sensations in your body feel. Everything starts feeding into everything else. And this is a very vicious feedback loop to be in. Because the more intense your thoughts become, the quieter your logic gets, and then the more intense your body starts to feel. Everything begins compounding on top of itself. That's why it's so important to understand that when these bodily reactions show up, you have to calm the body first before you can calm the mind. You have to be able to identify the response in order to interrupt the cycle. And when you're able to recognize what's happening and start calming yourself, you can begin shifting your nervous system from reaction into recognition. And that shift is what creates safety. Being able to name the reaction you're having creates distance from the perceived threat. When you identify what's happening, you're telling yourself, I'm having an anxiety response, or this is a nervous system reaction. You move from being inside the experience to observing the experience. That small mental shift activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning and regulation, and it quiets the amygdala. What was once overwhelming becomes something you can witness. Our nervous system hates ambiguity. Uncertainty can fuel panic and reduce clarity. And when intense sensations show up without explanation, the body assumes there's danger present. That's why identifying the response matters so much. It answers the unspoken question of what is happening to me. If you're able to label what is going on, it can reduce the fear because the unknown is becoming known. And naming an experience is inherently regulating. It's the internal equivalent of someone saying, I see you. You're not crazy. And what you're experiencing makes sense. For people with anxious or trauma-based attachment, this kind of internal validation is especially calming because it replaces past experiences of emotional misattunement with something new: understanding, recognition, and safety. When you name what's happening inside your body, you interrupt the spiral. You interrupt the feedback loop. That spiral thrives on fusion, body sensations blending with catastrophic thoughts, which then creates more sensations, which leads to more catastrophic thinking. It feeds itself, and naming the experience breaks that loop by inserting awareness between the stimulus and the reaction. The stimulus is the trigger. For those that don't know what a trigger is, for me, one example of a trigger is music. There are certain songs I've had a hard time listening to in the past because they bring me back to stressful periods in my life or remind me of a specific person. The music itself becomes a trigger, so when I hear it, I become activated. When you're able to identify what your triggers are, you can start anticipating the kind of response that might show up. And with that awareness, you can slowly begin breaking the cycle so you can regulate instead of react. And that's where your choice comes back in. You're regaining agency of yourself. You're regaining awareness. You're able to breathe instead of panic and pause instead of react. You can ground yourself instead of chasing reassurance. And the important part here is this: you don't have to fix anything. You just have to recognize what's happening. Some people use grounding phrases in these moments of nervous system activation. Sometimes I'll say things like, I'm safe, nothing bad is happening, I'm not in danger. Other people might say, or other examples might be, this is a response, not a reality, or my body is remembering something. And this matters for healing because long-term regulation isn't about eliminating your reactions, it's about understanding them without judgment. Every time you identify a response instead of fighting it, you teach your nervous system that activation does not equal danger. And over time, that response will start to soften. The spiral loses its grip, and safety becomes something your body can learn again. I started learning about nervous system activation because I wanted language for what was happening inside of me. I wanted understanding. I wanted my responses to soften. I didn't want to feel like my emotions were running the show. And I wanted my relationships to feel calmer and less like an emotional roller coaster. That's why I talked about boundaries in the second episode, because attachment and boundaries are inseparable. Attachment is about safety. Boundaries are about how we protect that safety. They go hand in hand. Attachment asks, am I safe with you? And boundaries ask, how do I stay safe without losing myself? When these two are aligned, relationships feel grounded and mutual. But when they're misaligned, people may overextend, withdraw, or cycle through attachment-driven reactions. Your attachment style shapes how close you want to be, how you respond to distance, how you handle conflict, reassurance, and vulnerability. Your boundaries shape what you allow, what you tolerate, and what you communicate, clearly and early on. Without boundaries, attachment reactions tend to run the relationship. But with boundaries, those reactions are contained, regulated, and understood. And to understand why attachment feels so powerful, we have to go back to where this system came from. The origins of attachment theory begin with a man named John Bowlby, a British psychologist and psychiatrist who worked extensively with children and families. Bowlby became interested in attachment while studying the emotional impact of separation between children and their caregivers, particularly during times of war, hospitalization, and loss. What he noticed was that children didn't simply adjust to separation. They experienced profound distress, and that distress had lasting effects on their emotional development. At the time Bowlby was developing his theory, the dominant belief was that children primarily needed food, discipline, and structure. Emotional closeness was considered secondary to those needs. Bowlby challenged that idea by proposing something much more radical for that time, that humans are biologically wired for connection. Closeness to a caregiver wasn't just comforting, it was necessary for survival. This idea was later supported by research, most famously through studies involving Harry Harlow and rhesus monkeys. In these studies, infant monkeys were given a choice between a wire mother that provided food and a soft cloth mother that provided warmth and comfort. The monkeys consistently chose comfort over food. And the monkeys who were deprived of physical touch and comfort didn't thrive, even when their basic nutritional needs were met. What this showed was that contact and comfort are required for survival, not just food or discipline. Bowlby argued that these early relationships create an internal blueprint for how we experience safety, trust, and intimacy throughout our lives. And this is important. Attachment isn't something we grow out of. It doesn't disappear. It evolves. The next major figure in attachment theory is Mary Ainsworth. Ainsworth showed us what attachment looks like in real life. She studied infants and their caregivers using a research method called the strange situation, which observed how babies responded to separation and reunion. The goal wasn't to see whether a baby cried or stayed calm. It was to understand how infants use their caregiver for safety and regulation, especially during moments of stress. The researchers focused on how infants responded to separation, how they reacted to unfamiliar people, and most importantly, how they behaved when reunited with their caregiver. During the reunion phase, 5 key behaviors were closely observed. The first was proximity seeking. Did the infant move toward the caregiver when distressed? The second was contact maintaining. Once close, did the infant cling, hold on, or try to stay connected? This reflected how much reassurance the infant needed to feel secure again. The third was resistance. Did the infant seek closeness while also pushing the caregiver away? This often looked like crying while stiffening, arching the back, or hitting. This behavior reflected ambivalence. I need you, but I'm upset that you left. The fourth was avoidance. Did the infant turn away, ignore, or actively avoid the caregiver upon their return? This suggested the child had learned to minimize emotional expression rather than seek comfort. And the final behavior was the infant's ability to return to play. After reunion, could the child calm down and re-engage with their toys? This was one of the strongest indicators of security, if they could. It showed successful emotional regulation. The child felt safe enough to explore again. The experiment itself lasted about 20 minutes when it was conducted, and it involved a series of structured steps. The caregiver and infant entered a room with unfamiliar toys, and researchers observed how freely the infant explored while the caregiver was present. A stranger would then enter the room and briefly speak with the caregiver, and then attempt to interact with the infant. This tested how the child responded to unfamiliar people when the caregiver was nearby. The next step came the first separation. The caregiver quietly left, leaving the infant with the stranger. Researchers then observed distress, protest, and coping behaviors. After this, the caregiver would then return and comfort the infant while the stranger left. This reunion was a key observation point for the researchers, not because of how upset the infant became, but because of how easily they were soothed. The caregiver would then leave again, this time leaving the infant completely alone. And this created the highest level of stress observed. The stranger would then come in and attempt to comfort the infant. And researchers observed whether the infant accepted comfort from someone other than the caregiver. Finally, the caregiver returned once more and comforted the infant. This final reunion provided the clearest insight into the child's attachment pattern. What the strange situation demonstrated was that attachment is revealed under stress, and that security is defined not by the absence of distress, but by the caregiver's ability to help the infant regulate. From this research, we were able to identify secure anxious, and avoidant attachment patterns, which would later expand to include disorganized attachment, or also referred to as anxious avoidant. These findings continue to shape how we understand emotional regulation, trust, and safety with others, and why separation, silence, or reunion can feel so intense in adult relationships. What Ainsworth found was that children responded to distress in patterned ways, depending on how emotionally available and consistent their caregivers were. And those patterns reflected how safe or unsafe the child felt in relationships. From this work, attachment styles were identified not as personality traits, but as adaptive strategies, ways the nervous system learned to survive, regulate, and stay connected over time. One of the most important concepts to come out of this research is protest behavior. When infants are separated from their caregivers, they cry, reach out, search, and panic until contact is restored. This is not manipulation, it is biology. Protest behavior is the nervous system way of saying, I need safety restored. And protest behavior doesn't disappear in adulthood. It just changes its shape. As adults, protest behavior might look like repeated texting, over-explaining feelings, pulling away to see if someone follows, shutting down when hurt, or becoming hyper-aware of tone, timing, or response speed. These behaviors aren't flaws. They're nervous system strategies, attempts to restore a felt sense of safety and connection. Now I want to walk you through each attachment style, starting with what a safe and secure attachment style looks like. When I think of safety and attachment, I think of secure attachment. Secure attachment is what John Bowlby originally described as the attachment system working the way it's meant to. In his observations, securely attached children use their caregiver as a secure base. When the caregiver was present, the child felt safe enough to explore. When the caregiver left, the child felt distress. And when the caregiver returned, the child sought comfort, calmed down, and regulated. Secure attachment does not mean there is an absence of distress. It means that distress can be repaired. Mary Ainsworth observed the same pattern in The Strange Situation. Securely attached infants showed upset during separation, but once reunited, they were able to seek comfort and return to a regulated state. This kind of attachment forms when caregivers are consistently responsive, not perfect. No caregiver is perfect. It is important to be somewhat emotionally attuned to what the child is needing, though. Through that attunement, the child learns that their emotions are allowed, that help will come when they ask for it, and that they can explore without losing their connection. In adult relationships, secure attachment often looks like emotional flexibility. Secure people are comfortable with both closeness and independence. They enjoy connection, but they don't panic when there's space. In real life, this might look like texting throughout the day without spiraling. If a partner gets busy or plans change, they might feel disappointed, but not abandoned. Someone with secure attachment can self-soothe and reach out for support. They communicate needs directly rather than through protest behavior. Instead of testing or withdrawing, they might say, I feel closer when we spend consistent quality time together, or I need reassurance when plans change last minute. Conflict doesn't feel like a threat to the relationship. Secure partners focus on repair rather than rupture. They trust both themselves and their partner. And if something truly isn't healthy, they trust themselves to leave. As Bowlby emphasized, secure attachment allows people to move freely between connection and autonomy. Love feels grounding, not consuming. Now, anxious attachment develops when the attachment system is activated but soothed inconsistently. In John Bowlby's work, children with unpredictable caregivers learned that closeness was possible, but not reliable. So the nervous system adapted by staying hyper-alert. I talked earlier in this episode about my own hypervigilance and hyper-awareness, and that lines up closely with anxious attachment as observed in Mary Ainsworth's Strange Situation. In The Strange Situation, anxiously attached infants showed intense distress during separation and struggled to calm even after reunion. Some clung tightly while remaining inconsolable. Others expressed anger alongside their need for comfort. And this tells us something important. The child wants connection, but doesn't trust it to last. Developmentally, anxious attachment forms when love is inconsistent. The child doesn't know when comfort will be available, so they learn to amplify their needs in order to be noticed. In adulthood, anxious attachment often shows up as a fear of abandonment and a heightened sensitivity to distance. Small changes feel big. A delayed text can trigger thoughts like, did I say something wrong? Or are they losing interest? Uncertainty becomes especially hard. Casual dating, undefined relationships, or emotional ambiguity can feel unbearable. Anxious attachment may lead to overgiving or overfunctioning, planning dates, providing emotional support, minimizing your own needs to avoid being too much. Reassurance can temporarily calm the nervous system of someone with anxious attachment. Questions like, are we okay? Aren't manipulative, they're attempts to survive and regulate. Physiologically, anxious attachment activates the fight or flight response. You might feel a tight chest, racing thoughts, or an urgency to reconnect, even when you logically know you should wait. Bowlby described this as an attachment system that never fully deactivates because safety was never consistent enough to allow rest. In other words, the nervous system struggles to move into rest and digest. Healing anxious attachment isn't about becoming less emotional. It's about teaching the nervous system that safety can come from within as well as from others. My anxious attachment showed up most strongly during moments of uncertainty or conflict. When my partner pulled back emotionally, my body reacted immediately. Distance felt threatening, and space felt like something I had to fix. What I've come to understand is that my partners may not have had the capacity or the language to express what they were feeling in those moments. But that didn't mean I couldn't advocate for myself. Waiting in silence, minimizing my needs, or hoping clarity would eventually arrive meant placing my emotional fate in their hands. And that gave them control. Not intentionally, but still. I realized that self-abandonment also often disguised itself as patience. The more I centered around their inability to communicate, the less I centered my own need for safety, clarity, and consistency. Healing has meant learning that I can hold compassion for someone else's limitations without surrendering my voice or tolerating emotional ambiguity that harms me. I practice naming what I need. I set boundaries around uncertainty. And I remind myself that advocating for myself isn't rejection, it's self-respect. That shift hasn't made me less caring or less understanding. It's helped me stay grounded in my own agency. And when you have agency, connections become a choice, not a gamble. The next attachment style I want to talk about is avoidant attachment. Avoidant attachment develops when the attachment system is activated, but is consistently met with rejection, dismissal, or emotional distance. In the work of John Bowlby, some children learned over time that expressing distress didn't bring comfort. So instead of escalating their needs, they adapted by minimizing visible need altogether. In Mary Ainsworth's strange situation, avoidantly attached infants often appeared calm during separation and reunion, but physiologically, measures told a different story. Elevated stress was still present. The distress existed even if it wasn't expressed. Avoidant attachment isn't about the absence of emotion, it's about suppression. Developmentally, avoidant attachment forms when caregivers are emotionally distant, uncomfortable with vulnerability, or overly focused on independence. Based on these experiences, the child learns that needing others leads to disappointment, that emotions aren't welcome, and that relying on themselves feels safer. In adulthood, avoidant attachment often shows up as emotional withdrawal during conflict. When tensions arise, distance feels regulating. Vulnerability doesn't feel safe, not because they don't care, but because emotional exposure feels overwhelming. Avoidantly attached individuals often intellectualize feelings, analyzing instead of experiencing them. When asked what they need, they may genuinely not know or say nothing at all, even when a lot is happening internally. If a partner expresses need or dependency, avoidant individuals can feel flooded and may pull away further to regain emotional control. Internally, many feel overwhelmed and lack language for what's happening. So distance becomes the regulation strategy. Bowlby emphasized that avoidant attachment isn't true independence, it's defensive self-reliance. As I've shared in previous episodes, this was a pattern that showed up strongly in my last relationship, possibly alongside anxious avoidant traits, which brings me to the final attachment style. Disorganized attachment. sometimes called anxious avoidant attachment, which reflects a breakdown in the attachment system itself. Bowlby theorized that attachment becomes disorganized when the caregiver, the source of safety, is also the source of fear. This creates an unsolvable dilemma for the child. Ainsworth observed infants who didn't fit cleanly into anxious or avoidant patterns. These children might approach the caregiver and then freeze, collapse, or turn away. With disorganized attachment, the nervous system learns two conflicting truths at the same time. I need closeness to survive, and closeness isn't safe. There is no consistent strategy for regulation. A childhood shaped by disorganized attachment feels unpredictable. The caregiver might be warm and loving one day, and distant, overwhelmed, volatile, or frightening the next. There is no pattern to rely on, no rhythm that tells the child what to expect, so the body stays alert. You need closeness to survive, but you also learn that closeness can hurt. When you reach for your comfort, your nervous system hesitates. When you pull away, you feel alone. You adapt moment by moment, approach, freeze, appease, withdraw, whatever keeps you safe right now. You learn to read the room better than you read yourself. You notice shifts in tone, energy, footsteps, silence. And you become attuned to other people's moods because your safety depends on it. Sometimes you take on responsibilities that aren't yours, emotionally or practically, because someone has to hold things together, and it might as well be you. When something upsetting happens, repair isn't guaranteed. Feelings may be ignored, minimized, or met with fear or anger, and you're left alone to make sense of experiences that are far too big for a child to hold. Over time, your nervous system learns a painful contradiction. The place I go for safety is also the place I need protection from. That contradiction doesn't disappear in adulthood. It lives in the body. It shows up later as confusion and closeness, wanting intimacy and fearing it, craving connection and pulling away, emotional swings, hypervigilance, or not knowing what you need until you're already overwhelmed. And this part matters. Nothing about this response is broken. Disorganized attachment is not a flaw. It's intelligence under pressure. It's the nervous system doing the best it can in an environment where consistency didn't exist. Healing begins when the body experiences something different: predictability, boundaries, repair, and safe connection. Slowly, the nervous system learns that closeness no longer has to mean danger, and that safety can exist without chaos. Your attachment style is not who you are. It's how your nervous system learned to survive connection. And the good news is your nervous system is adaptable. In the next episode, we'll talk about how to recognize your attachment patterns in real time, what's happening in your body, your thoughts, and your behaviors, and how to begin moving toward earned secure attachment. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And thank you for doing this work with me. If this episode did resonate with you, please don't forget to follow me on TikTok and Instagram at the So Happy Together podcast, and follow the show on Spotify so you never miss an episode. I will talk to you all soon.